On va commencer. Bien, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Mathieu Ménil. Je suis responsable de la fonction renforcement des capacités de Réseau-1 Québec. Et je vous souhaite la bienvenue à un autre webinaire du Réseau-1, notre troisième de l'automne. Aujourd'hui, nous avons l'immense plaisir d'accueillir Clare Hill, qui présenterait des résultats d'un essai randomisé qu'elle avait fait sur l'utilisation des gants stérilisés ou non stérilisés pour des procédures mineures dans les soins de première ligne. Avant de commencer, je veux tout d'abord vous rappeler de quelques petites consignes. Cette séance est enregistrée afin de pouvoir être conservée dans la bibliothèque des présentations du Réseau 1. Donc, on vous invite à fermer vos micros pendant la présentation, puis je peux voir que vous avez tous fait ça, donc bravo. À la fin de la présentation, je vais vous permettre de poser des questions à Claire par rapport à sa présentation. Pour ceux qui ne savent pas, il est actuellement 2 heures du matin à Queensland, donc un gros merci à Claire pour se rendre disponible pour ce webinaire puis d'être avec nous. Puis on va prendre un instant maintenant pour juste changer de présentateur et je vais remercier Claire en personne.
Hi, can I just check that you can see me and hear me?
We can see you and hear you. Welcome, Claire.
Great, thank you, and you can see my slides.
We can see your slides as well. So listen, I want to take just a minute just to thank you for being available to this webinar, despite it being so late where you are in Australia. And on behalf of myself and the other members of the network of Réseau-1, just to say that we really appreciate it. Okay, so please feel free to begin. Okay, and at the end of your talk, I'll handle the questions for you, okay?
Great, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to do this presentation, so thank you too. So I might start if that's okay. I'm going to talk today about, I was asked to do this presentation when I met Jeannie Hegarty at NatCrag last year. Actually, I'll just do the conflicts of interest slides first. So the only grant or research support that I get is from the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. There's no speakers fees or consulting fees. I work for Queensland Health and also for University. There's no commercial support, just financial support from the College of GPs in the form of educational grants, no in-kind support and no conflicts of interest support. I met Jeannie Hegarty at NatCrag last year, where I was presenting a recent practice-based randomised control trial that we'd just undertaken, which was comparing sterile with non-sterile bloods. So today I was going to talk a little bit about my background and how I got into primary care research, talk about this particular trial, and also just talk generally about practice-based research and just the tips I have and what enablers and barriers there are to conducting this sort of trial in a primary care or a GP setting. Okay, can I just check you can hear me okay, Matthew? So my background, I actually qualified in the UK. I got my medical degree in Liverpool in 1990. And I moved to Australia in 1992. They had a lovely advert at the top of Ireland on the back of the British Medical Journal telling us all to move to Australia, and actually a number of us did. So I mainly worked in North Queensland. A new university opened up in North Queensland where I live, and I got a position as a very part-time position as a senior lecturer in 2004. I did a PhD in skin cancer diagnosis management in 2010, and then at the beginning of this year I was promoted after a couple of other stages to chair in the Department of General Practice. So that's sort of my pathway. We're just, you can see the pointer, so Mackay is here sort of in, oh no, sorry, it's there, in the top right-hand corner of Australia. And Townsville, which is the major hub, is here. This is the other map of Australia. We have quite a lot of sharks. Shark attacks recently down in this area, and I think everybody complains in Australia of lots of different animals that are about to attack you at any moment. We actually have a crocodile just on our beach at the moment, which is a bit of a problem. And this is James Cook University. I think there's a lot of synergies with some of the universities in Canada which cover rural areas. So we cover a huge area in the north of Australia. Townsville's the hub. Mackay, where I am, is sort of 400 kilometres from Townsville, so it's sort of big distances of isolated towns, covering mainly rural areas. And our vision is to provide medical care to underserved communities, be they rural communities or Indigenous communities. So my research interests, I'm generally interested in researching primary care, and we run a fairly loose practice-based research network, which would be more vital, I think, if we had more funding, but we do run trials within this network, and we're particularly interested in practice-based randomised controlled trials. I'm also interested in skin cancer diagnosis and management, and also sexual health and chlamydia infection. I'm clinically still in general practice and also in sexual health. So I'll just talk about the trial now, which was sterile versus non-sterile green box gloves for minor surgery, which is a prospective randomised control non-inferiority trial. I'll just acknowledge Shamka Vishriharan, who was a medical student project at Honours Research, Petra Butler, who's my long-standing collaborator, and Debbie Kinder, who's a practice nurse at the practice where this trial took place. Just to put this in context, this is the fourth of 5 consecutive randomised control trials that we've run in the area of wound management. So Australia's actually got the highest incidence of skin cancer in the world. We've got the highest incidence of basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. I think New Zealand overtook us for melanoma, but altogether we've got a very high incidence of skin cancer. And most cases are actually managed in general practice by general practitioners. A few go to secondary care, but most are managed in primary care. That's more the case in rural areas, like the area where I live, where we don't have a dermatologist or plastic surgeon. And after minor surgery, so most of the skin cancers are excised with simple ellipses and sutures. And we actually have a very high infection rate after minor surgery. And we're actually not quite sure why. We think some of it's due to the tropical humid environment, and some of it is probably due to workplace behaviour. We have cane farming and mining as our main industries, and some things about morality. We have the people who tend to run around with no shoes on and go fishing a lot and stuff like that. So some of it is behaviour of all populations, I think. And this trial was interesting because the doctors and nurses at this particular practice actually chased me to do this trial. They've been having coffee room conversations about whether we needed to use sterile gloves to do the minor excisions and whether non-sterile gloves were just as good. And some of the doctors and nurses had one opinion, and some had another opinion, and they really actually wanted to do a trial to see which was the better glove type. And they've done an audit which showed that glove type made no difference, but they very much initiated this trial and it belonged to them, and it was what they wanted to do. In the literature, there are some guidelines. There's actually 2 conflicting guidelines, one from the College of GPs, which actually allows us to use non-sterile gloves for minor procedures, and one from the NHMRC, which is a more sort of overarching medical governing body, which actually recommends sterile gloves for minor procedures. And we couldn't find much in the literature about sterile versus non-sterile gloves. Most of the existing literature actually showed that there was no difference. The best of these studies was actually a Canadian study done in 2004 that was done in an emergency department. It was contaminated surgery, so it was repair of simple lacerations, but they showed no difference between non-sterile and sterile gloves as far as infection rate was concerned. And the other studies really were a bit underpowered, or not really clinically relevant to our situation. So our clinical question was whether non-sterile gloves were actually worse than sterile gloves for minor skin excisions. We didn't really want to see whether they were better. We couldn't expect them to be, but we wanted to see whether they were just as good. So I explained Mackay actually has a population of about 80,000 and there's 100 practicing GPs. As I mentioned before, there's no dermatologists or plastic surgeons. So this was a prospective randomized control non-inferiority trial. We didn't actually attempt to blind anybody for this trial because this was obvious what type of gloves people were using, although the outcome assessors were actually blinded. We actually did it in a single general practice clinic, and consecutive skin surgery patients were eligible to participate. We had a surgical skin excision protocol, and practice nurses were responsible for the recruitment and most of the data collection. We found in all these trials that the practice nurses, who are excellent researchers, are very good at recruiting these patients into our trials. It's sort of a small rural area, and everybody really wants to help everybody else, and it's a very sort of personal relationship sort of place. So the eligibility criteria were minor skin excisions and all bottom sites, and we excluded people who were taking oral antibiotics or who were immunocompromised, or if it was contaminated surgery, or if they had an allergy. We collected lots of data on as many different variables which were considered to be risk factors for wound infection as possible, because we wanted to make sure that both sides of our baseline data were balanced. The sample size calculation, because it was a non-inferiority trial, we had to decide on a preset margin for non-inferiority. Based on our baseline infection rate at 8%, we decided that 50% we would consider clinically significant for non-inferiority, so we needed 372 patients with a non-inferiority margin of 50%. And we had a set skin excision protocol, which I won't go into in great detail as well. So we completed this trial between June 2012 and March 2013. The control was using sterile gloves, and the intervention was using non-sterile box gloves. We used this definition site infection, which is about as close to the gold standard definition of an infection as there is. Unfortunately, there's not many validated infection scales, and this is the gold standard, so infection had to be within 30 days, and either there had to be a purulent discharge from the wound, or a positive wound culture, or the doctor diagnosed the infection, and we didn't count stitch abscess as infection. So we randomised 493 patients, 250 in the non-sterile group and 243 in the sterile group. We lost a few to follow up on both sides, and we had a non-complier. We analysed 241 and 237 in each group. This is a busy slide, which I've been told never to put into presentations, but our baseline data is basically balanced on both sides. We don't do scores generally on our baseline data, which is what the margin difference is improved balanced. So in the sterile glove group, the infection rate was 9.3%, so we had 22 infections out of 237 excisions. In the non-sterile group, it was actually lower, it was 8.7%, and our confidence intervals completely overlapped. So the difference in infection was minus 0.6%. It was actually, infection rate was actually higher, sort of counterintuitively in the sterile group than the non-sterile group in this trial. And we did a sensitivity analysis using available case analysis for our intention to treat analysis. Intention to treat and protocol were pretty similar, and then we did a sensitivity analysis of two scenarios that lost follow-ups, have infection, or they don't have infection, but with all the different scenarios we didn't get anywhere near our pre-intervention margin for non-inferiority. So in our study, the use of non-sterile gloves were worse than the use of sterile gloves in terms of infection rates. There's other reasons for choice of gloves. So for instance, doctors may prefer a certain type of glove. There's lots of different size choices in the sterile gloves compared with the non-sterile gloves, or they may prefer a particular type of gloves. And there were a few limitations in this study. So our limitations, the diagnosis of infection is quite subjective. It's difficult to measure the sort of training techniques of GPs, and that's a possible confounding factor or a variable that's difficult to measure. We have this high baseline infection rate, and therefore our generalisability may be limited. This was only a single-centre trial, and our preset margin for non-inferiority in retrospect was possibly a little bit too liberal. And there is cost savings, so the sterile gloves are about $1 a packet or $1.10 a packet, and the non-sterile gloves are about 10 cents a packet. This is Australian money, so basically we would save about $1 per procedure if we use the non-sterile rather than the sterile gloves. And so our conclusion was the use of non-sterile gloves is not worse than the use of sterile gloves in terms of infection rates and minor skin procedures in the setting. And I'll just acknowledge, so we did this project for we had a $20,000 grant from the College of General Practitioners in Australia, and I'll just acknowledge the GPs and practice nurses who apply part in the trial. And I'll talk about costs in a second. So just to put this into context, this was the fourth of a series of 5 trials. So the first study we did in 2006, and this was the second ever research project I ever did. I was very junior. I hadn't actually started my PhD at that point, but again, this was a GP sort of copying. It's actually GPs gave to our evidence-based medicine meeting, and 2 of them used to argue in the car about whether it was better to shower straight after a skin excision, whether it was safe to shower, or whether sutures should be kept dry for 48 hours. So we did a study comparing allowing patients to shower and get their sutures wet, as opposed to the control group, which was keeping their sutures dry and covered for 48 hours. And this, we sort of hit the big time very quickly with this study, because I think it captured the editor's imagination, and we actually got it published as a front page publication in the British Medical Journal. And this is really what I suppose what started our group of groups to be interested in this type of research. The second project, we looked at topical chloramphenicol, topical antibiotics to see if they, so I should say that the previous project we found there was no difference that patients could shower without increasing the risk of infection. The next study we used topical chloramphenicol to reduce the incidence of wound infection after minor surgery, and the result was that we found that it was statistically but not clinically significant. It was a reasonable reduced infection rate, which actually wasn't critically significant. We actually got a BMJ publication with that one as well. This is what I did for my PhD in actual fact. Third trial, we looked at oral antibiotics for preventing wound infection in the lower limb, where we have a very high infection rate. This is when I started to supervise honours students, and Sam Smith, we had a BMJ publication with this one. We were slightly underpowered, but what we found is that the infection rate went down quite dramatically from about 35% to 8% in this particular trial, and unfortunately this missed out on being adequately powered. The blood study which I've presented was our fourth study. We published that in the Medical Journal of Australia, but it was also named as one of our 20 research studies in 2015 for primary care physicians, which was very nice. And the final study we've just completed, it's about comparing alcoholic with acrylchlorhexidine as a skin antiseptic. And I'm just writing that up now, actually. Hopefully on Monday. So, in just the state of GP research in Australia, I imagine it's probably similar in Canada, but you get very little funding, and there's very few randomised controlled trials conducted in general practice because methodologically and practically they can be difficult. It is really important that we do these types of trials because GPs need to be informed by evidence that's been developed in primary care, not in hospitals where it may not be necessarily applicable to the primary care situation. And our guidelines need to be informed by primary care evidence as well. But funding, we only get 2% of our sort of national research grants, and I actually found out today that I got to get this another failure. So to get one of the larger grants, it is very difficult to get funding for primary care projects. So over the years, I've got a few tips about conducting practice-based research. I think my main tip is that it's important to choose questions that come from GPs or come from primary care practitioners, so they have to be grassroots, or from practice nurses as well, which some of these questions come from. They have to be grassroots questions that the GPs aim to make them work. It's important to have a personal relationship with the practice that you're working with, so the Kai where I am is a small place and we all sort of know each other a little bit. Sometimes not necessarily always a good thing, but personal relationships help. I've found over the years that asking the GPs actually to do anything is quite difficult, that they don't tend to collect data or contribute a great deal. But the practice nurses are actually fantastic as researchers and also data collectors and collaborators, so I've found it's really important to engage with practice nurses. Barriers to research, funding is an issue, and I'm going to talk in a sec, one of my last slides, just about how to make do on a very low amount of funding. Ethics takes time, we all know, and GPs don't always necessarily understand that, so that's sort of a barrier in the GP context. And just ensuring that randomisation is being done properly and quality data collection is being collected can be difficult at times. The Sterile Gloves project, we had some very experienced researchers, or practice nurses. I won't call them research nurses because they don't have official positions, but very experienced nurses who developed these projects. And recruitment was actually very easy, and we retained 97% of the patients with very few follow-up. Another tip for research in primary care, I think it's really important to look at your strengths. So in our region, our strength is that we just have all this skin cancer and the GPs and all of these skin cancers are excised in primary care, and also that we have this very high infection rate. So that's really quite unique to our setting, and this is an area that we've really exploited. So I think it's actually important to think what's unique in your setting, what do you have that other people don't have, what goes on in your particular region that really doesn't happen in other areas, and really try and exploit your own strengths or in fact your own weaknesses in our case, our infection rate. The fact is that our infection rate is so high we can use interventions to see if they change that infection rate, and the powering of the study means that we can that they're feasible and don't need as many patients as they would in a hospital setting where the infection rates are much lower. So other tips, GPs have to aim the project for it to be successful, keep things as simple as possible, and again engage practice nurses. Just research on a shoestring, low cost research. So for each of the projects I showed you before, we had about a budget of 20,000 for each of them. And some of these things may be a little bit controversial, but I tend to stick to one primary outcome. I'm not a great one for hundreds of secondary outcomes, so we've always studied surgical site infection as our main primary outcome. And you know, we'll do adverse outcomes as well, but I don't tend to do a lot of secondary outcomes like patient quality of life or sort of of economic analysis, because they're often the things that take the extra time and cost. So I tend to make these trials as simple as possible and just stick to the one primary outcome. By randomise at home, I mean we would never use an expensive sort of randomisation service that you have to bring to conduct the randomisation. We've always just made up the envelopes, opaque envelopes in the, using generated random number tables, and have them in a numbered system and made sure that everybody understands about allocation and other sort of things. But and that's never really been criticised. We've been always completely transparent about that. That does save money. Having a friendly pharmacist saves money as well. So for our trial where we used the intervention of Keflex, 2 grams of Keflex before sleep decisions from the lower end, we found out it's going to cost an absolute fortune to use a industrial company to prepare the medication for us. So we actually just used our hospital pharmacist and the medical student under the pharmacist supervision made up capsules with rice flour and Keflex in them, which were identical, and that saved us a great deal of cost. And similarly in the chloramphenicol trial, we found a compounding pharmacist to make up a topical preparation which matched the chloramphenicol. So sometimes you can use a pharmacist rather than an external company to prepare medication. And we don't pay the GPs for their time because it would be too expensive, but we pay the practice nurses for their time in data collection, which is a nominal fee. In some cases, the practices have actually kept the fee, but other times, for example, the practice nurses have kept the payments that we've paid them. And it's not a huge amount of money, it just pays for their extra time spent with data collection. So, yeah, rather than paying the GPs, we actually pay the practice nurses. So, yeah, some of those things may be a little controversial with sort of ideas. Oh, good, I've finished. So, so that's my presentation. So I've just talked about my background, used the example of the sterile blood trial, and just talked about practice-based research and enablers and barriers, and research on a shoestring. But I'll pass over back to Matthew to see if there's any questions.
Thanks very much, Claire, for that presentation. Okay, really, really interesting. You can hear me okay?
I am. It's a relief, actually, because I've just gone for the past half hour not being quite sure whether I was cut off or not. So, so that's great. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we'll take any questions that people have now. I have a few questions myself, if anybody, if there are no questions. Oh. Okay, so, yeah, I get you. Is there anybody logged in right now? Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui sont sur la présentation qui aimeraient poser une question oralement à Claire? Si c'est le cas, levez votre main, puis je vais demander à Daniel de faire la connexion. Sinon, pour l'instant, je ne vois pas. Mais donc, I think I'll ask you first my question. I have just a very basic question about the research culture in primary care practice in Australia, around where you are in Queensland. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do clinicians see research when you work with GPs, when you work with the nurses? What is their appreciation of research in general?
Yeah, I mean, compared with the UK, there isn't a great research culture. So I know that in the UK they have all sorts of practice incentives to participate in research, and therefore I think there's a lot more interest. In Australia, there's really no great incentive to participate in research, so I find in order to be able to engage them, it has to be their research question or something that they're interested in. So I think because there's no real practice payment or practice incentives aren't linked to research, there isn't a great culture of research. It's mainly based on goodwill and being inquisitive rather than anything else.
And this is so the original question to look at sterile versus non-sterile techniques, was this something that you brought to the clinicians, or this came from them and it just seemed to match your interest well?
It very much came from the clinicians, and the first question in the series of trials, which was about whether you could shower in the first 48 hours safely after having a skin excision. I actually thought it was a bit of a rubbish question, to be honest, but it was what we had an evidence-based medicine group, and it was what they wanted to do as a group, and I was the one with the university sort of position, so I made it, but was slightly sceptical about it. And I was just amazed when it did so well and got this BMJ front page publication. And after that, it became my research interest, I suppose, but I think initially it was forced on me a little bit by the clinicians. But in virtually every case, the question has come from the clinicians rather than from me. I must say it's now become my research interest because I realised that it was actually very relevant and a very just a feasible area to do practice-based research in.
Can you talk about that more? Because that's a common thing that we as researchers are confronted with. The clinicians may have a very relevant question that's directly relevant to their practice, but sometimes it doesn't mesh perfectly with our own research interests, and sometimes it takes us a little bit out of our comfort zone to address questions that are not directly in line with our own research program. So talk about that tension that it created a bit within you, about how you decide to accept that, and what were the challenges or facilitators to that?
Yeah, I think it was helpful that I was so junior at that point that I didn't really have a research program, so I think that helped. And also, just where we are, because it's such a, because we're a regional area, I don't really get performance. No one really watches what I do, and I'm not really driven by a greater sort of university agenda. So I do have a lot more freedom to really sort of choose what I'm going to do, more so than probably people in positions at other universities. But I must admit, initially, I didn't particularly like this idea, and I think I got a bit railroaded into it, but anyway. And I mean, since then, there's been a few clinician ideas which are just about, let's prove that cycling improves health, and I've just sort of thought, no, it's other questions that I've just actually passed on because they haven't really suited my agenda. But I think, most clinician questions are really worth listening to, and even if you encourage them to do a literature review or a systematic review, as the answer to what's the next thing that should be done about that topic, I still think it's useful to listen to them.
And I think that the fact that you get the work published in BMJ is actually amazing, and it must have been a long way of convincing you. So what was their reaction to having that research published in such a prestigious journal?
It was such a strange thing, because I really didn't think, again, I was a bit underwhelmed by this project, and I was going to send it to an Australian journal, and it was actually one of the research group that said, oh, why don't we send it to the BMJ, they do publish that sort of thing sometimes. It was actually an English doctor. So I thought, oh, well, I'll send it in, and I checked with Petra, who's sort of who was my PhD supervisor later on, and she said, well, you can have a go, but, your success rate's very low. And I was just amazed. And then when they accepted it, I was amazed. And then I sort of expected it to be hidden at the back somewhere. And I remember that day pressing on the BMJ electronic website, and it suddenly appeared on the front page. But I think it was, a lot of these things are luck. It's like grant applications, a lot of it is luck as well, the luck of the draw who you get on the panel. And I think this particular project was something that they were looking for. They were looking for grassroots GP projects. And the primary care editor at the time was Dominic McCauley, who I think now is the editor of the Canadian Medical Journal, so you may be familiar with him. And I think it particularly captured his imagination. So, but I must say the GP group were pretty impressed when they saw it was on the front cover. And also when their artwork study got published, but just got recommended as one of the top 20 projects for primary care physicians. They were pretty impressed by that as well.
And the fact that you've maintained this relationship with the clinicians, do you feel that that's changing a little bit the culture within the clinics that you're working with?
A little bit, but not necessarily positive. They're really, really helpful, but some of the older GPs that initially did the projects 10 years ago, now retired, and there's sort of newer, younger GPs, so it's changed a little bit. With the project I've just finished, which was aqueous versus alcoholic chlorhexidine, we actually had to recruit 930 patients, I think, and they're a little bit over it at the moment, so I'm not going back to for an least. I think the other thing is to work out how far you can push people and not go beyond that. So I'm sort of going to leave them alone for a little while now.
Okay. And you mentioned that it's important for clinicians to sort of look around and see what are the strengths in terms of research and they want to work on. So what do you tell researchers when they find that they have a really burning question that they have and they don't see someone in their environment that seems to have that strength? How do they sort of negotiate that? What are the resources for them, and do they still turn to researchers at that point, and how does that sort of work itself out?
The question was when they see something they're really interested in, but it's not particularly of high prevalence in their practice. Is that
when it doesn't seem to be on the agenda of any of the researchers around them.
I see. It's hard, isn't it? It depends what's available to you in Canada. I mean, if that was in Australia, actually, probably that GP could go and get a little grant from the College of GPs and do their own little pilot study. We still have those sorts of grants available. I'd probably, if it was really burning, I'd probably just recommend that they just did a little study themselves and see what they can do with it. So, because that's how we started out, really. We sort of just decided we were going to do it. So, yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned the important role that the practice nurses played in collecting the data and being supporting the research. Can you talk just maybe generally about the importance of doing interdisciplinary research, like having multiple types of professionals involved in the research?
I mean, I don't want to make the practice nurse's role as any lesser than the GP's role, because they're all, the practice nurses I work with also have excellent research ideas, and one of them's gone on to do some master's subjects, and some, actually she published a paper herself in a completely different subject. So, I mean, I suppose, yeah, the practice nurses are essential to the projects, and they always have been, much more so than the GPs. I think sometimes they just have a little bit more time, and also I think they just sometimes just have better organisational skills than the GPs as far as data collection and things are concerned. So, I mean, the other discipline that we've worked with has been the pharmacists as well, and they actually get really quite excited about some of these research questions, and they're only too happy to help as much as they possibly can, because there's quite a strong research culture in pharmacy. So I do think all of these different professions can help with practice-based research.
And the design of your trial was a non-inferiority trial.
Yes,
you want to talk a little bit more about that design? Are there certain designs within experimental studies that you think are more feasible to conduct within primary care settings or practice-based settings?
I mean, I don't think you should choose your design based on feasibility. It's just, I think you have to look at your question and decide what it is that you're asking. So with sterile gloves and non-sterile gloves, we weren't asking whether the intervention, which was the non-sterile gloves, was better than the sterile gloves. We weren't really interested in that direction because we had no reason to think that they were better. We just wanted to know whether they were, and we didn't really want to know whether they were equal. We didn't really want to do an equivalent study. We just wanted to know whether they were not worse. So it was the question, sometimes you have to really look at your question and think, what is it that we're asking? And with this particular question, what we wanted to know is, are non-sterile gloves good enough? Are they not worse than the sterile gloves? So it's more the framing of the question, which was the reason for the non-inferiority trial rather than feasibility. I mean, in actual fact, you can usually get away with recruiting less for the non-inferiority study than you can for looking for a difference. But that shouldn't really be the reason for your study design.
And I noticed that the average age of the participants in the trial was actually quite high. There was, I think they were in their 60s. Is that correct? And is that typical of this patient population that were concerned by these skin lesions, or?
Yeah, that's pretty representative. I mean, we actually have a fairly young patient population, but SCC, squamous cell carcinomas, to a certain extent basal carcinomas, are due to cumulative sun exposure, and that's the majority of the skin excisions are for the SCCs and the BCCs, so it's just the age range that present the skin excisions, basically.
And so you mentioned that, oh, yeah?
Hi,
Danielle?
Yeah, Danielle. Thanks, Claire, very much for the presentation. I think it'll be, it's just super interesting to see an example of a kind of project that we're trying to fund here with Réseau-1 Québec. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about scale-up and if there's been any interest in pursuing that trial in other PBRNs maybe in different regions of Australia, or even if you know, the results of your trial led to practice change in other settings beyond where you're located.
So the first question was whether any of the trials have been repeated in other networks or other regions. Is that right, Danielle? I mean, I have had some interest from other, the quick answer is no. And it would actually be good to do some of these trials in other regions. The only problem is if there isn't a high infection rate, you need a much bigger sample size, which makes the trial much less feasible. So that's the problem with repeating them. With the trial where we were underpowered and with excisions from the lower limb, I have been trying to get a grant for a couple of years to scale that up and do it across the entire region, but I've just lost out on that grant application again. So, but one day, because for the big scale of it, we do need a lot more funding, but I haven't managed to quite get there. So, but I do think it would be useful for some of these studies to be done in other countries and other areas to sort of look at compare the outcomes because they're not necessarily generalizable. Practice change, there's been a bit of practice change, so the wetting of sutures it's more been a local practice change that the local GPs who took part in the trial now allow patients to shower after their skin excisions. And because it's a very sweaty sort of tropical area, it's actually important for them to be able to shower, so that's sort of a local practice change. The single dose of oral antibiotics for lower limb, the College of Skin Cancer Physicians have put that into their guidelines now. The sterile gloves, non-sterile gloves, it'll take a little bit for that to filter into Australian guidelines because they're not quite due to be upgraded at the moment. But the Dutch College of GPs have contacted me about that one and referencing it for their guidelines about non-sterile gloves. So that's being referenced for the Dutch College guidelines at the moment. So there's been a little bit of practice change. I'm not great at actually doing the translation part of this research and pushing practice change, I suppose. It's something I need to do a little bit more, but some of it has filtered over into guidelines.
That's great. And are there sort of resources around you or different, sorry, Matt. Just to follow up, that I was just wondering if there are in your university setting resources around you, or people that are interested in that issue of scale up, because you said you are part of a PBRN, and so are there folks that are looking into that question, and if so, what are the resources that are available? Because we're looking at developing strategies for scale up for our projects, and I'm curious to hear what you're thinking.
I think the quick answer is no, really, Danielle, which probably isn't all that helpful. Some of these, of these 5 projects, some of them didn't really need scaling up because we felt we got the sample size and we did a big enough study and it didn't really need another version in our region. But a version in another region would be useful. And the one which I'm trying to scale up, I've tried to get external grants for, and I just can't get them at the moment. So and the university doesn't really have resources for that one. So yeah, so that's not particularly helpful because probably the answer is no. But again, we're quite a regional university, so we're one of the bigger institutions.
So Claire, I think we'll just try to wrap things up now. So maybe you can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to take the time to thank you once again for making yourself available to do this great webinar. Okay, and it's been recorded, so hopefully other people will be able to access it. It'll be put on the website for Réseau-1 Québec shortly. Là, je vais changer en français, là, on va faire un petit switch. Donc, juste pour vous dire qu'il reste à peu près 5 minutes ou un peu plus dans le webinaire. Donc, j'aimerais remercier Clare pour cette présentation super intéressante de la recherche qui se fait vraiment dans les milieux cliniques, qui proviennent des intérêts, des choses qui intéressent vraiment les cliniciens eux-mêmes. Donc, c'est vraiment intéressant de voir comment les cliniciens peuvent avoir ces partenariats-là avec différents partenaires en recherche. On a juste vous faire remarquer que notre prochain webinaire va avoir lieu le 27 novembre. Donc, il y a deux lauréats Réseau-1 Québec qui vont présenter, Philippe Tamba et Karim Skirej, qui vont présenter sur une analyse transversale des projets des lauréats. Puis aussi vous dire que tous nos webinaires sont accrédités. Donc, donc je vous encourage de contacter Daniel Shermer si c'est quelque chose qui vous intéresse d'avoir des crédits pour avoir participé à ce webinaire. Si vous n'êtes pas membre, on vous encourage de devenir membre du Réseau 1. Puis si vous avez des questions par rapport à... Si vous pouvez poser des questions à Claire après les webinaires, n'hésitez pas de nous écrire. Vous pouvez contacter Daniel Shermer également. Puis on va faire le suivi avec Claire. Donc, thank you very much, Claire. Get some sleep. Really appreciate you participating. And we'll be in touch with you again soon.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Merci tout le monde. Bon après-midi et bonne fin de semaine.